Our speaker today is Bob Hill, and Karen tells me she hates it when people say that someone needs no introduction, but but if anybody fits that description, it would be Bob, since he has been speaking here since the very beginning of this congregation. So today, Bob is going to be in search of his soul.
Sounds like a lost cause to start with. Harry, I wouldn't recommend that anybody go to Nam, north or south. I would like to start with a disclaimer. Last night I was going over this talk, and when I got through, I looked up at Jane and I said, I don't like this talk. And she said, don't you think it's a little late for that kind of insight? And I had to agree, yes, it was. But anyway, nevertheless, here we are. I want to talk about the soul. What is the soul? Is it a real thing? Is it a figment of our imagination? Can we see it? Can we experience it? Well, the interesting thing is the idea of the soul has been around for many millennia. And to start with, I would like to just give you some words from some of the cultures that means the soul in different languages. Psyche, Anima, Atman, Savara, Regmangat, Nefesh, Hodachuk, Lakol, Tune, Prana, Duk, Geist, and many, many more. In the Icelandic culture, it was the Sala. And Anglo-Saxon started out with soul, and it has been modified to soul. There's hardly a primitive culture that I can find that did not believe in an afterlife. Virtually every culture believed not only in an afterlife, but in some life force that survives the death of the body. In 1828, Charles Nadir of Paris said the following: the different names for the soul among nearly all peoples are just so many breaths, variations and onomatopoeic expressions for breathing. It was the Greek philosopher Diogenes that reported that Xenophanes was the first person to equate breath with the word soul, and he used the term psyche. I think it's interesting that these early societies all equated the soul with breath. And we know now from science that as we breathe in 10 to the 22nd power of atoms, nitrogen, hydrogen, oxygen, etc., to be used to make our body parts. And as we exhale 10 to the 22nd power of these same atoms. These atoms go to make our heart, our lungs, our kidneys, our skin. The interesting thing is, while we're sitting in here, breathing in and out, we are exchanging body parts. So if you don't like the person you're sitting near, you better move, because you're taking in part of their body parts to be yours. The idea of the soul after life was seldom ever questioned until the end of the 19th century, when science began to flourish. With the proliferation of science, the notion of survival after physical death fell out of favor, even to the point of some people seeming silly or irrational, or most importantly, unverifiable. Yet in spite of this, there are so many people who still believe in the soul and that the soul survives after the body has died. This topic is so vast and there's so much material about it that it's really hard to get a handle on it. To quote Thomas More, who wrote Care of the Soul, he said, and I quote, "There is no understanding of the soul," close quote. As Kierkegaard said, if you define me, you negate me. And trying to put this talk together and running into so much material and so many different ideas, I think I often felt like the maroon Greek warrior in the Odyssey, wrestling with the sea god Proteus. The more I wrestled with it, the more this thing transmogrified into one beast after another beast after another beast. It's only after many years of independent reading about this that I have a sense that there might be a slight crack in the cosmic egg and that we're getting closer to some kind of understanding. When I began doing the research, I was literally overwhelmed by the amount of material, by the hundreds, even thousands of high-powered intellects who have written about the soul. Aristotle, Rudolf Ott, Emerson, Santayana, Descartes, Jung, Plato, Viktor Frankl, Pablo Neruda, Joyce, Goethe, Schweitzer, Lawrence, Keats, Campbell, on and on and on and on. Mircea Eliade, in his 1964 journal, don't you just love that name, Mircea Eliade? I love it. He said, in postulating the autonomy of the soul and its survival post-mortem, man has opened himself an unlimited perspective, thanks to which a whole phenomenology of the spirit has become possible, close quote. Philosophers, writers, psychologists, great thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, Jung, Freud, have used this idea of a soul almost like a lodestone to keep pointing to some magnetic north. In other words, it seems to, if they focus on it, they have a direction. When you examine the notion of the soul, it must include the ideas of the mind, the innerscapes, the spirit, free will, the meaning of consciousness, and this notion of a life force. There are two basic schools of thought, the materialistic school and the functional school, and how they look at the soul is sort of interesting. The materialistic school includes empiricist, behaviorist, reductionist, whereas the fundamentalists include the non-material, the humanistic, and the mystical. The materialistic falls under the rubric of classical physics. They insist on three criteria for the soul to exist. Number one, can we perceive it? Number two, can we directly perceive its effects? And number three, can it be used to explain a perception? In other words, their idea is that nothing can exist if we can't perceive it in the material world. The non-materialist point of view is quite different. It's more like field theory or quantum physics. The conditions under which something is considered real would go something like this. Is there a definite, clear, and compelling observation that we can make about the soul? For example, I think, therefore I am. We use the simplest constructs possible to account for our observations. That's the idea of parsimony. The other is the two notions of harmony and coherence, which includes face validity. If it has face validity to you, it could exist. In Newtonian physics, a lake would be more than just the water. It would be the land that surrounds the lake. A life points more than birth and death. It's everything surrounded it. In field theory, if you can conceptualize it, then it exists. The old theory says that thought is a function of matter. The current theory is more like matter is a manifestation of thought. Materialism denies the existence of mind altogether, whereas the extreme idealism would say that everything is a perception. Now, to paraphrase Sir John Eccles, he's a Nobel Prize-winning physicist. He says, and I quote, "There are no colors in the real world. There are no shapes or sizes or smells in the real world. There is only erratically ambiguous, ceaselessly flowing quantum soup," close quote. Sir John Eccles' idea is that we freeze this perception, we freeze this quantum soup into perceptions that we can understand, and perceptions that we can make sense out of. So I guess that leaves us with a question. Is the real world just soup? And we perceive it as we need it, as we want it, or as we fear it? Or is all of this just pablum for childish minds, and if we can't see it, taste it, touch it, smell it, hear it, then it doesn't exist? The question of survivability after death has been pondered for all times, and there have been thousands of answers, usually to fit the needs of the time. It's really been only in the last 100 years or so that we have debated the idea of survivability after death and the existence of soul. From a religious perspective, we have basically a two-dimensional problem. First is, no matter what we do, we have to please the deity. And secondly, we have to care for the soul. I think that the acceptance of the belief in a soul is the primary underpinning of religion. Interestingly, in the Old Testament, the soul, or the nephesh, translates to life or self. The soul or the nephesh is not seen as something separate from the body. In Genesis, the story of creation, God made Adam out of the dust of the earth and breathed into him the breath of life, and Adam became a living creature, a nephesh, a soul. There again we see, even in the most ancient associations of the soul, it is with breath. That's in the Hebrew text. Note, this did not say that God gave Adam a soul. It does not say that Adam henceforth had a soul. It says God made Adam out of the dust of the earth, made him a living being. Adam became a living soul. So the question proposed by the Old Testament is, does humankind have a soul, or is humankind a living soul? The New Testament expresses several different streams of thought, but that certainly doesn't make it any clearer. Paul preaches the dual concept of the body and the soul, and he offers the idea of the body, the soul, and then Paul adds the spirit. So now we have three things: body, soul, spirit. And all that did was just confuse me even more. Aristotle held the notion that the body could not be separated from the soul, and postulates that the soul was simply the vitality that pervades and animates the body and the mind. Most Christians today get their notion of body and soul as separate entities, and they get this from St. Augustine, which of course is the foundation and the notion of resurrection. To solve this long fought over problem, how do you resurrect a dead person whose body is decaying or has completely decayed? Well, if you separate out the soul from the body, then you have the idea that you can resurrect the soul. Now, the Catholic Encyclopedia, and yes, there is such a thing, much to my surprise, the Catholic Encyclopedia seems to have settled on the definition of the soul as follows: the source of thought activity. Then the Catholic Encyclopedia makes a complex issue even more mind-boggling by saying that God has a supply of souls. They are not anybody's in particular until he infuses them into a human embryo. So according to the encyclopedia, the soul is created or given by God at the time he infuses it into the person. Now this message is unmistakable. At the time before impregnation, the soul does not exist in a person. This is in direct conflict to the idea that the soul transcends time. And yet, Jesus spoke of everlasting life. The entire concept of the soul is just incredibly fraught with conflicts, even within church writings. Descartes' concept was that there are two distinct orders of being: substance, mental substance, and material substance. And the soul was located in the pineal gland. Gilbert Rye, in his concept of the mind, sees the mind or the soul as a thing. But it's not a thing like a material substance. It's not a physical substance, but a tenuous, elusive, ethereal type of substance. The stuff that dreams are made out of, free and independent of ordinary matter. In thinking about these two different concepts of the soul, I came across a quote from Robert Oppenheimer. And he says, I quote, "These two ways of thinking, the way of time and history, the way of eternity and limitlessness, are both a part of man's efforts to comprehend the world in which he lives. Neither is comprehended in the other or reducible to it. They are, as we have learned in physics, complementary, each supplementing the other, neither telling the whole story." I literally could give you thousands of quotes supporting each side. But we're still left with the question of, does anything survive death? Does the death of the body mean personal annihilation, or is it part of an individual's exit with something that can remain and be resurrected. I've read and I've thought a lot, and I cannot come to any conclusion. But to fathom the unfathomable leads us to immediately question human mysteries. As King Lear said, quote, "Take upon us the mystery of things as if we were God's spies," close quote. This mystery has to do with the curious mixture of the world outside of us and the world inside of us, outer space, inner space. I think if you're not bewildered by the idea of this, then you haven't thought much about it. What is the essential self? Are we just mechanical engines running off of random electrical charges and chemical reactions? Or are we just a stream of consciousness coming from that void of non-material energy and information? What is the life-giving principle, to use Aristotle's definition? I don't know if a part of us survives our physical death. I know my soul relates to my far-ranging innerscapes: love, fantasy, creativity, excitement, zest, vigor. My soul pours into my work. It pours into my dreams, my desires, my hopes, my disappointments, and my plans. So why ponder the imponderable? Why even bother? It may be as the painter P.A. Mondre said, is it just nostalgia for the universe? We may also question the unquestionable because we do have minds, or we do have souls. Perhaps it is the soul that drives us to ask questions that we cannot answer, to fill that black hole in the center of ourselves, that search for the personal I, that self that passes for me. Emily Dickinson said, "I cannot see my soul, but I know it is there." When I read Viktor Frankl's account of surviving Auschwitz, knowing that his wife had been murdered in that same camp, I felt there was a soul. Her memory of love saved his life, and I'm sure it saved his sanity. Rollo May, in his Cry for Myths, encouraged me when he said, "To live is to war with the trolls in my heart and soul." Some of this has to do with memory. Memory seems to have something to do with the soul and the mind. And then I remembered something important in research that I found interesting. Two outstanding neurophysiologists, Dr. Carl Lashley and Dr. Carl Pribram, once did a very cruel experiment. They were trying to discover where memory is stored in the brain. What they did first is take a lab rat and teach that rat to run a maze. And then afterwards, they carefully took out small slices of the brain to see if he could still run the maze. Much to their surprise, they took out practically all of the brain of the rat, and he could still run the maze. After that research, other researchers concluded that memory is stored in every cell of the brain holographically. Other researchers have added to that and say that in that holographic memory, it's not just the memory of that person, but it is the memory of that species, the entire memory of creation, stored holographically in the cell, in a single cell in every body. We find some evidence for this in the idea of cloning. You can take a single cell and you can clone something. Not only can you clone an animal, but what you have in that animal is a memory of a previous exposure, for example, to a bacteria. And immediately that animal starts building antibodies to a particular bacteria, even from a single cell. The notion of a holographic memory has profound implications for memory survival, mind survival, and perhaps soul survival. Most of you know what a hologram is, and if you don't, if you look on your Visa or your MasterCard, they have a little stereogram on most of them. In thinking about this now for some time, I have to wonder if the soul, the life force, the memory of who and what I am is some type of holographic representation. Not only is it physical, but I can experience it. Not only is it not physical, but I can experience it. The notion of the soul or memory being stored holographically in every cell may explain why we cannot physically find any evidence for the existence of a soul, and yet for thousands of years, many people have clung steadfastly to that belief. It may be, as Oppenheimer said, each belief supplementing the other, neither telling the whole story. This entire argument, to me, is much like the argument for God. If you do not believe in God, there is probably nothing I could say to you to convince you that God exists. If you do believe in God, there is probably nothing I can say to you to convince you that God does not exist. So perhaps God is just a holographic representation of everything that has ever been. God is not there except for a sculpture of memory. In conclusion, I don't know what I think. But I do believe in some things about the soul. I do believe in soul food. I do believe that singers like Aretha Franklin and Ray Charles sang with pure soul. That some writing comes from the soul, that some paintings reflect the soul, that I can be soulful, that we can be soulmates, that I put my soul in my work, and that sunrise and sunset both soothes and exhilarates my soul, that each of us is a wonderful soul. With that, I would tell you that Dostoevsky reminds us, love life more than love the meaning of life. Thank you.